son's teacher has been giving him some unusual homework lately. A few months ago, we had to move to a new city because of my job. It wasn't easy. My wife, Anne, and our 9-year-old son, Mark, had to leave behind everything familiar. Our quiet neighborhood, friends, routines. The city we moved to is a lot busier than what we were used to, but the pay increase made it seem worth it. And found a new job pretty quickly, and she settled in well, even making some new friends. Mark, too, seems to be adjusting at his new school. Mark's in the 3rd grade now, and his new class is bigger than the one he had back home. It didn't seem to bother him much, though. He's already made a couple of friends, and he talks about them a lot. He also really seems to like his teacher, Mrs. Wagner. She's younger, probably around 30, and Mark's is always full of stories about how fun her lessons are. I met her briefly on Mark's first day, and she seemed nice enough. Each evening, Mark would come home with some homework to do. I've never been a huge fan of homework, but Mrs. Wagner's assignments were pretty straightforward. One night, he had to ask me about my job and come up with 3 questions about it. Another time, he had to find 3 interesting facts about his favorite animal. Simple stuff that didn't take too long to finish. I always made a point to ask Mark about his homework and help him out if he needed it. But one night, about 3 weeks after he started at the new school, things felt off. Mark came home looking upset. When I asked him what was wrong, he shrugged it off, saying he was fine. Then I asked about his homework, and he told me he didn't have any that night. That was strange. He'd had homework every single day so far. Before I could ask more, Mark went straight to his room and shut the door. He rarely did that. I figured he might just need some space, but something didn't sit right with me. He stayed in his room most of the night, except for dinner. At the table, he seemed more like his usual self, chatting, cracking jokes, but after dinner, he went right back to his room and shut the door again. And then I decided to give him some space, but later, I went to check on him and let him know it was bedtime. When I opened his door, Mark was already asleep, slumped over his workbook. I walked over quietly to wake him up and tuck him into bed. That's when I saw the homework assignment he'd been working on. The title was, "Would I Miss My Parents If I No Longer Lived With Them?" I froze. What kind of assignment is that for a group of 9-year-olds? My stomach turned as I read what Mark had written. I would miss both my mom and dad very much. I love them both a lot, and they help me with everything. I love spending dinner time with them, but I would probably love someone else as much as them if I had to. Like you were saying today, Mrs. Wagner. That last sentence sent chills through me. I would probably love someone else as much as them if I had to. What had Mrs. Wagner been saying to him? Why was she putting ideas like that in his head? I didn't know how to respond. I decided not to tell him right away. I didn't want to worry her until I had more information. Instead, I resolved to confront Mrs. Wagner myself the next day and get to the bottom of this. The next morning, I decided to drop Mark off at school like usual, but this time, I walked him to his classroom. When we got there, Mrs. Wagner was alone, tidying up some papers on her desk. She greeted me with a smile as I stepped inside. "Good morning. How are you?" she asked warmly. "How's Mark settling in?" I told her he was doing well overall, but that I had a couple of concerns. She tilted her head, curious, and asked what they were. I was wondering about the homework assignment from yesterday. I began, trying to keep my tone neutral. The one about whether they'd miss their parents. Honestly, it's a strange question to give a group of 3rd graders. And Mark wrote something about loving someone else if he had to. Something he said you mentioned. Could you explain that? Mrs. Wagner chuckled lightly, which immediately put me on edge. "Oh, that," she said. "Yesterday, we were talking about how parents love and protect their kids, but also how there are always others, like teachers or relatives, who can step in and help if needed. It's meant to reassure them, not upset them." I didn't feel reassured. I was about to press her further when the sound of students approaching cut me off. A line of kids walked into the classroom in perfect formation, 2 by 2. They greeted Mrs. Wagner politely, one after another, and took their seats without a hint of chatter or fuss. Mark sat down next to another boy, his posture suddenly straighter, his eyes wide and fixed ahead. I glanced around the room. All the students were staring at Mrs. Wagner with an unnerving intensity, their hands folded neatly on their desks. Something about the scene felt wrong. Still, I reasoned that this might just be part of their morning routine. I told Mark I'd pick him up after school and left, though my unease lingered all day. I left work early that afternoon to make sure I could be at the school on time. When the bell rang, most of the kids came bounding out of the school gates, shouting and laughing as you'd expect. But Mrs. Wagner's class emerged differently. They walked out in a single file line, moving in perfect unison. The sight made my stomach turn. Mark climbed into the car, his face blank, and buckled himself in without a word. I asked if he was okay, and he just nodded and said, yes. That was it. The ride home was silent. When we got inside, Mark headed straight to his room and shut the door. I knew something was very wrong. I decided to wait until and got home to tell her everything. When she walked through the door half an hour later, I sat her down and explained everything. Mrs. Wagner, the strange homework, the unsettling behavior. Mark listened, her face growing more concerned with each word. Let me try talking to him, she said once I finished. Maybe he'll open up to me. I agreed, and she went to Mark's room while I waited in the living room. After about 15 minutes, Mark came out holding his workbook. Dad, can you help me with my homework? He asked, his tone completely flat. Of course, buddy. Let me see what you've got, I replied, trying to sound encouraging. He handed me the notebook, and I looked at the top of the page. The assignment read, research the best way to inject your parents with anesthetic. I barely finished reading before I felt a sharp sting in my neck. My hand shot up, and I touched the needle protruding from my skin. Mark was holding the other end, his face blank as ever. The world blurred and went dark. The last thing I saw was Mark standing over me, watching as I collapsed to the floor. When I came to, and screams jolted me awake, I sat up, groggy and disoriented, and saw her pacing the room, tears streaming down her face. He's gone, she cried, her voice shaking. Anne's gone. I noticed a small red mark on the side of her neck. She'd been injected too. My mind raced, but my body still felt sluggish from the drug. I fumbled for my phone and called the police. I explained everything, and they assured me that officers would be dispatched immediately to help find Mark. When I hung up, I realized it was already 9 a.m. I called the school next, hoping maybe Mark had gone there. A woman answered the phone. Mrs. Wagner's class? No, I'm sorry, none of the students from her class have shown up today. Mrs. Wagner isn't here either. It's very unusual, she said. Her words confirmed what I feared. Something terrible was happening, and Mark was at the center of it. The empty bus chilled me to the bone. Its engine hummed softly, lights still on, doors wide open, yet no one was inside. It didn't make sense. I stepped closer, peering through the windows, but the interior was as eerily still as the rest of the town. Thinking Mrs. Wagner and the children might have hurried to the motel, I decided to check there. The motel was just a short walk from the town hall, so I set off, my footsteps echoing in the quiet night. When I arrived, the building was dark. No lights on in the office, no movement in any of the rooms. I knocked on the manager's door, but no one answered. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Unease coiled in my stomach. I turned back toward the town hall. The bus was still there, but as I approached, I noticed something had changed. The lights inside the bus were off now, and its engine had gone silent. It was as if the vehicle had been abandoned entirely. Then I heard it. Faint whispers carried by the breeze, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, scanning the empty street. The whispers seemed to grow louder, though the words were unintelligible, almost as if they were coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Mrs. Wagner? I called out, my voice breaking the unnatural quiet. Kids? Is anyone there? No reply, just those whispers. I moved toward the source of the sound, rounding the corner of the town hall. That's when I saw it. A faint blue glow coming from the woods just beyond the edge of town. Despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I pressed forward, drawn by both curiosity and concern. As I neared the glow, the whispers sharpened into fragments of words, phrases that chilled me to my core. Chosen, prepare, new home. The glow intensified, and I could make out figures, small, childlike silhouettes standing in a circle. They were dressed in the same old-fashioned clothes I'd seen earlier, their pointed hats creating strange shadows in the light. Mrs. Wagner stood at the center of the circle, her long black hair catching the ethereal glow. She held something in her hands, a small, ornate box. She spoke softly, her voice a melodic hum that seemed to weave into the whispers. I wanted to call out again, but my voice caught in my throat. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. Mrs. Wagner lifted the lid of the box, and the glow pulsed, bright and blinding. The children didn't move or flinch. They stood perfectly still, their faces serene but utterly devoid of life, like porcelain dolls. Then, as abruptly as it began, the light vanished, plunging the woods into darkness. The whispers ceased. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in my pocket. When I turned it on, the clearing was empty. No children, no Mrs. Wagner, not even footprints in the dirt. It was as if they'd never been there. I staggered back toward the town, my mind racing. The bus was gone. The street was silent once more. The only evidence they'd ever been here was the faint smell of burning wood lingering in the air. I've tried to piece together what I saw that night, but nothing makes sense. I didn't tell anyone in town about it. Who would believe me? But now, hearing about Dylan and the other missing kids, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, somewhere. The police took Mrs. Gillen's account seriously but struggled to make sense of it. A large figure carrying a woman? A group of children walking in eerie unison in the dead of night? It sounded like something out of a nightmare. As the officers combed the area, they found no traces of the children, Mrs. Wagner, or the figure Mrs. Gillen described. Even the blood-stained ground where I'd seen Mrs. Wagner was spotless, as though the scene had been scrubbed clean. The knife was gone. They found the school bus parked outside the town hall just as I described. Its interior was pristine, too pristine. No fingerprints, no belongings, nothing to suggest 23 children and a teacher had spent any time there. Even the odometer showed no record of the miles it should have accumulated from the trip. The police were baffled, but their confusion only deepened when they reviewed the surveillance cameras around town. Footage from earlier in the evening showed the bus arriving and the children disembarking, their movements slow and synchronized. But then the camera at the main intersection, the one that would have captured their path toward the motel, cut to static. A full 15 minutes of missing footage. What unsettled me most, however, was what the officer on duty showed me next. "Take a look at this," he said, pulling up a video file from inside the police station. It was footage from the holding cells, recorded just minutes before I woke up in the alley. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. An empty room with flickering fluorescent lights. Then, the shadows shifted. A faint, humanoid silhouette emerged, taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its limbs unnaturally long and its movements jerky, as if it didn't belong in this world. The figure moved toward the camera, and just as it loomed close enough for me to make out details, a face obscured by what looked like a mask or a veil, the screen went black. "That's impossible," I whispered. The officer nodded grimly. "We don't know what it is or how it got in here, but it didn't leave any trace. No door was opened, no alarms were triggered. It's like it wasn't really here." I stared at the screen, dread knotting in my stomach. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just after the children. It was leaving breadcrumbs, as though it wanted to be seen. That night, I lay awake, replaying the events in my mind. The children's monotone voices, the strange clothes, Mrs. Wagner's cryptic words. Everything pointed to something far beyond comprehension. But the image of that shadowy figure haunted me most. Was it connected to Mark and the others? And if so, what did it want with them? The next morning, I received an unexpected call from the police. They had tracked down a lead, a remote farmhouse about 15 miles from Freighton. The tip had come from an anonymous caller who claimed to have seen a group of children matching the description walking into the woods near the property late at night. I didn't hesitate. Against their advice, I insisted on joining the officers heading to the farmhouse. If there was any chance Mark was there, I needed to see for myself. As we approached the property, an overwhelming sense of foreboding settled over me. The farmhouse was decrepit, its windows boarded up, the surrounding fields overgrown. A faint hum seemed to emanate from within, almost imperceptible, but it set my teeth on edge. Inside, the house was dark and silent. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the stench of mildew. But in one of the upstairs rooms, we found something that stopped us cold. A circle of children's shoes, neatly arranged around a single, unlit candle. The officers exchanged uneasy glances as I crouched to examine the shoes. Among them was a pair I recognized immediately. Mark's sneakers, scuffed at the toes from months of playground games. "Dylan," I whispered, my voice cracking. But as I reached for the shoes, the candle flickered to life on its own, casting the room in an eerie glow. And then we heard it, the sound of children's laughter, distant but growing louder, echoing through the walls. The officers drew their weapons, but I knew deep down that bullets wouldn't stop whatever was coming. The laughter turned into whispers, the same ones I'd heard in the woods. Words began to form, chilling and clear. They belonged to us now. The whispers hung in the air, a sinister chorus that seemed to surround us. The officers exchanged panicked glances, gripping their weapons tighter. "They belong to us now," the voices repeated, as if daring us to respond. "Mark," I called out, my voice cracking with desperation. "If you're here, please say something." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, I heard it, a small, hesitant voice. "Dad?" I spun around, my heart pounding. The sound had come from downstairs. I bolted out of the room, ignoring the officers' shouts to wait. As I descended the creaking staircase, the air grew colder, each step feeling like I was descending into a void. "Mark," I called again, my voice echoing through the empty house. I reached the ground floor and froze. The front door, which we had entered through just moments ago, was wide open. Beyond it stretched a foggy expanse that hadn't been there before. The fields were gone, replaced by an otherworldly landscape. A dense, gray mist swirling around skeletal trees that seemed to twist and writhe. And in the middle of the mist stood Mark. He was barefoot, dressed in the same light blue robe I'd seen the children wearing in Freighton. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at me. "Mark." I stepped toward him, but as I did, the mist seemed to push back against me, an invisible force keeping me from reaching him. "You can't take him," a voice said behind me. I whipped around to see the silhouette from the surveillance footage standing in the doorway. Up close, it was even more grotesque, its form shifting and rippling like smoke, its mask-like face featureless except for two empty eye sockets that seemed to bore into my soul. "What do you want with him?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my question. Then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "He is chosen. They all are. You would not understand." "Chosen for what?" I shouted. "He's just a child. Let him go." The figure took a step closer, and the temperature in the room plummeted. "You should not have followed. Leave now, while you still can." Before I could respond, the whispers returned, louder this time. Their words indistinct but filled with a sense of malice. Mark reached out a hand toward me, his expression pleading. "Dad, help me," he said, his voice cracking. I surged forward, pushing against the invisible barrier with all my strength. "Mark, hold on, I'm coming." But as I reached out, the mist began to swirl around him, obscuring his figure. His hand was the last thing I saw before he disappeared completely. "No!" I screamed, collapsing to my knees. The mist receded, and the fields of the farmhouse returned as if nothing had happened. The officers found me minutes later, sobbing in the empty yard. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but their skeptical expressions told me they didn't believe a word of it. That was 2 days ago. Since then, I've been plagued by nightmares. Visions of Mark and the other children, standing in a circle around a dark figure, their faces blank, their voices chanting in unison. I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, but the images refuse to fade. The police have called off the search, citing lack of evidence. But I can't stop. I won't stop. Mark is out there somewhere, and I'll do whatever it takes to bring him home. And then, this morning, I received a package on my doorstep. Inside was a single item, Mark's workbook, the one he'd used to write down the chilling homework assignment. Scrawled across the cover in red ink were 3 words: "He is ours." The sight of the workbook paralyzed me. My hands trembled as I held it, the crimson letters on the cover glaring up at me like a warning. I cautiously opened it, each page a new layer of dread. The first few pages contained Mark's usual schoolwork, math problems, spelling exercises, and simple essays. But as I flipped further, the entries became erratic. The handwriting grew uneven, the sentences nonsensical. They whisper in the night. "Mrs. Wagner says the old ones will come soon. The stars are wrong, but they will fix them." The last page made my breath catch. Drawn in dark, jagged pencil strokes was a symbol, a circle surrounded by jagged lines, with an eye at the center. Beneath it were the words, "We belong now." I didn't know what the symbol meant, but I could feel its weight, as though it was alive, pulsing with malice. My instinct screamed at me to burn the notebook, to get rid of it, but I couldn't. This was my only link to Mark. I decided to call the police and show them the workbook, hoping it would convince them to reopen the investigation. When I explained everything to the officer on duty, he promised to send someone over. But they never came. That night, I stayed awake, the workbook sitting on the coffee table like an accusation. My wife refused to look at it, retreating to our bedroom in tears. The house felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in. At around 2 a.m., the whispers began again. They were faint at first, like a distant breeze, but they grew louder, echoing through the house. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. "Mark!" I called out, my voice hoarse. No response, just the whispers. An eerie chorus of overlapping voices, their words incomprehensible. I grabbed a flashlight and the baseball bat I kept by the door, then began searching the house. The whispers seemed to move, drawing me from room to room. They led me to the basement. The air grew colder as I descended the creaking stairs, the beam of my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The whispers were louder now, reverberating off the concrete walls. In the center of the basement was the workbook. I had left it on the coffee table, but here it was, open to the page with the symbol. As I approached, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single voice, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. "You were warned." The flashlight flickered, then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty space. The air shifted, and I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, swinging the bat wildly, but it struck nothing. "He is ours now," the voice growled again, closer this time. I turned back toward the workbook, and in the faint glow of the basement light, I saw it. The symbol was glowing, its lines pulsing like veins. Then, a hand reached out from the pages, a small, pale hand. "Dad," Mark's voice whispered, weak and distant. "Help me." Without thinking, I grabbed the hand. The world around me dissolved. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the basement. I was standing in a vast, desolate wasteland. The sky a swirling vortex of black and crimson. In the distance, I saw a group of figures, children dressed in light blue robes, standing in a circle around a towering, shadowy figure. At the center of the circle was Mark. "Mark!" I shouted, running toward him. The shadowy figure turned to face me, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Its voice boomed across the wasteland. "You do not belong here." "I'm taking my son back," I said, my voice shaking but resolute. "He has chosen." "Mark." I ignored the figure and focused on my son. "You don't have to stay here. Come with me." Mark looked at me, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. I don't know how," he said, his voice trembling. The shadowy figure raised an arm, and the ground beneath me began to crack and crumble. "Leave now, or suffer the same fate." I had to act fast. The symbol, it was the key. I had seen it on Mark's workbook, and now it was etched into the ground at the center of the circle. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pin, the only thing I had on me. I scrambled to redraw the symbol, but with a critical change, I added a line cutting through the eye at its center. The ground shook violently as I completed the mark, and the shadowy figure let out a deafening roar. "No!" The children's eyes cleared, their blank expressions replaced by confusion. Mark stumbled out of the circle and into my arms. "Dad," he whispered. "Hold on to me," I said, gripping him tightly. The wasteland began to collapse around us, the shadowy figure disintegrating into a swirl of smoke. Then, everything went black. I woke up on the basement floor, Mark lying beside me. He was breathing, his face peaceful as if he were simply asleep. "Mark," I whispered, shaking him gently. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at me, tears welling up. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry." "It's okay," I said, holding him close. "You're safe now." The symbol was gone, the workbook reduced to ashes. Whatever had taken him was gone, for now. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet.